Hailed as a god of Wall Street, he effortlessly spends fortunes to acquire elite art masterpieces. Yet, behind this aristocratic facade, Leon Black allegedly funneled hundreds of millions of dollars to fuel Jeffrey Epstein's dark network. He allegedly used his supreme power to coerce and ruthlessly abuse vulnerable women behind closed doors, deploying multi-million-dollar gag orders to suffocate their cries for help. Why would a financial titan voluntarily purchase the death sentence of his own legacy, burying it all in the $158 million sex scandal of Leon Black? The story of his absolute worldview traces back long before the ashes of the 1990 financial catastrophe. Born in 1951, Leon Black understood the terrifying fragility of corporate power early on. His father, Eli Black, was a prominent executive whose tragic suicide following a business scandal left an indelible mark. By 1990, Leon Black's philosophy was fully forged in a new crucible: the investment bank Drexel Burnham Lambert. Throughout the 1980s, Drexel Burnham Lambert emerged as a dominant force on Wall Street. Powered by the high-yield or junk bond pioneered by Michael Milken, the firm transformed corporate finance. This instrument allowed investors to finance the takeovers of established corporations by taking on highly risky debt. It was a turbulent era of corporate restructuring, and Drexel was operating at its center. The culture at Drexel, often epitomized by its annual high-yield bond conference in Beverly Hills, was highly aggressive. The trading floors of that era were characterized by intense pressure and excess. It was an environment that typically rewarded the most extroverted and demanding personalities. But within this loud, chaotic machinery, Leon Black was an anomaly. He was not a screaming trader on the floor. He served as the co-head of Drexel's Mergers and Acquisitions Department. He was the quiet, brooding architect operating in the background. Those who sat across the negotiating table from him during the 1980s noted a terrifying physical presence. He was a physically imposing figure who did not yell or pound his fists. Instead, he used silence as a blunt weapon. He would sit perfectly still in a boardroom, staring blankly at the spreadsheets, letting the heavy, uncomfortable quiet suffocate his rivals. He would drain the emotion out of the room until the opposition conceded simply to end the tension. He treated venerable American corporations as mere numbers on a ledger. While others at Drexel reveled in the spotlight, Black watched, calculated, and internalized a fundamental lesson. The loudest men in the room are usually the most vulnerable. Then the music stopped. In 1990, the federal government moved in to dismantle Drexel Burnham Lambert. The firm collapsed under the weight of severe securities fraud investigations and a suddenly frozen credit market. Michael Milken was heading to federal prison. The sensory reality of Wall Street in those weeks was one of absolute terror. Thousands of high-flying careers were instantly vaporized. Paper fortunes were wiped out overnight. Financial historians often describe the atmosphere as apocalyptic. The sound of paper shredders running constantly, executives carrying out their belongings in cardboard boxes, and a pervasive, suffocating panic. The old symbols of wealth were melting away in real time. But amidst the burning wreckage of Drexel, Leon Black did not panic. He did not flee the industry in disgrace like so many of his peers, desperately seeking to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the junk bond era. One man surveys the smoking ruins not as a tragedy, but as the greatest buying opportunity of the 20th century. When the federal regulators forced Drexel into bankruptcy, they were left holding a massive portfolio of junk bonds that the market now believed to be completely worthless. The institutions that had purchased these bonds, insurance companies, savings and loans, banks, were also imploding. The entire financial system was paralyzed by fear. This precise moment reveals his fatal weakness, the psychological trait that would define his entire existence and ultimately dictate his spectacular fall: a relentless, insatiable need for absolute control. Black operates on the fundamental, unwavering belief that human chaos is merely an asset that has not yet been correctly priced. While other bankers saw bankrupt companies, shattered livelihoods, ruined pensions, and the destruction of their own industry, Leon Black saw pure, unadulterated leverage. He knew exactly what those junk bonds were worth because he had helped structure them. He understood the underlying cash flows of the companies tied to that debt. He realized that the panic of the market had driven the price of these assets far below their intrinsic value. Rather than walking away, Black gathered a small circle of loyal Drexel alumni. They stepped directly into the debris and began sifting through the wreckage. They approached European banks, notably Credit Lyonnais, and convinced them to provide the capital needed to buy up these distressed assets for pennies on the dollar. It was an act of supreme, almost sociopathic financial confidence. He was effectively buying the ruins of his own former employer to build a new kingdom. He established a new firm from the ashes. He called it Apollo. The name itself is steeped in a dark, almost poetic irony. Apollo, the Greek god of truth, healing, and light, chosen for a company that would thrive in the opaque, ruthless, and highly secretive world of distressed debt. The true anatomy of this financial empire was not built in polished boardrooms, but at a financial crime scene. In 1991, Leon Black secured his first independent kill. The junk bond market is a smoking crater. Michael Milken is in a federal penitentiary, and the American economy is sliding into a bitter recession. Up to this point, Leon Black was merely a highly skilled lay lieutenant who had survived the collapse of Drexel, Burnham, Lambert. But surviving is not the same as conquering. To build Apollo Global Management into the $800 billion Leviathan it would become, Black did not just need strategy. He needed raw, unadulterated capital. And he found it in the wreckage of California's largest life insurance provider, the Executive Life Insurance Company. The issue here isn't simply that Black bought a bankrupt insurance company. The issue is how he allegedly orchestrated an international financial conspiracy to do it, and how he left foreign executives to face the wrath of the United States Department of Justice while he walked away with the foundational billions that built his entire mythology. Executive Life was not just a corporation. It was a vault holding the retirement savings and life insurance policies of over 300,000 ordinary Americans. Under its former CEO, Fred Carr, the company had gorged itself on the high-yield junk bonds that Drexel had been peddling throughout the 1980s. When the market crashed, Executive Life's portfolio, nominally valued at nearly $12 billion, became toxic waste. Panic ensued. The California Insurance Commissioner, John Garamendi, seized the company to stop a run on its assets. The state was desperate to offload the massive, terrifying portfolio of distressed debt. They needed a buyer, and they needed one fast. Leon Black possessed the map to this treasure. Having worked at Drexel, he knew exactly which of those junk bonds were actually worthless, and which ones were attached to fundamentally sound companies that were simply suffocating under temporary high interest rates. He knew the intrinsic structural value of the $12 billion better than anyone on earth. But there was a glaring problem. Black had the intellect, but he did not have the money. He was a general without an army. to execute the greatest financial heist of the decade, he needed a backer. With incredibly deep pockets and a highly flexible interpretation of regulatory law, he found his perfect accomplice across the Atlantic in the form of Crédit Lyonnais, a massive state-owned French bank, and specifically its aggressive investment subsidiary, Altus Finance, led by a man named Jean-François Hénin. Here is where the narrative shifts from opportunistic investing into a labyrinth of alleged illegality. American law at the time was explicitly clear. Foreign government-owned banks were strictly prohibited from owning domestic insurance companies. Crédit Lyonnais could not legally bid on executive life. But Leon Black's fatal weakness, the unshakable, arrogant belief that absolute control can bypass any law if the legal architecture is complex enough, was about to manifest perfectly. If the front door was locked by federal regulators, Black and his French counterparts would simply build a trapdoor. According to federal investigators who later unraveled the scheme, the plan was a masterpiece of corporate deception. Altus Finance would provide the billions needed to buy the junk bond portfolio, but to circumvent the U.S. laws prohibiting foreign ownership of the actual insurance business, they set up a network of secret front companies. They used ostensibly independent French insurance entities, such as MAF, to act as the legal buyers of the insurance operations. Behind closed doors, hidden in Swiss safes, were secret contracts known as portage agreements. These illicit documents proved that the front companies were merely puppets, completely controlled and financed by the French government-owned bank. The execution was swift and ruthless. In late 1991, the California regulators, desperate to stop the bleeding, accepted the bid orchestrated by this transatlantic alliance. The consortium bought the massive junk bond portfolio for roughly $3.25 billion. Pennies on the dollar for a portfolio that had a face value of nearly $12 billion. Leon Black and his newly formed firm, Apollo, were installed as the exclusive managers of this massive debt portfolio. This is the exact moment the Apollo empire is truly born. Black did not use his own money. He used French state capital, funneled through a legally highly dubious structure to seize control of the most lucrative distressed asset pool in American history. And his compensation structure was unprecedented. Apollo would receive staggering, continuous management fees simply for overseeing the bonds, plus a massive percentage of the profits when the bonds were eventually sold. And then the inevitable happened. The American economy recovered. The junk bond market stabilized. The companies that had been teetering on the edge of bankruptcy began to pay off their debts. The toxic portfolio that Black had acquired for $3.25 billion suddenly skyrocketed in value, generating billions upon billions of dollars in pure profit. The French made a fortune. Leon Black made his first true billion, establishing Apollo Investment Fund LP as a powerhouse that could not be ignored. Those billions in profit carried a steep human cost. The wealth did not materialize from thin air. It was extracted directly at the expense of the 300,000 policyholders of executive life. Because the California regulators had panicked and sold the assets at a fire sale price to Black's consortium, the actual individuals who held life insurance and retirement annuities saw their payouts slashed. Elderly pensioners, widows, and injured workers received only a fraction of what they had been promised, while a Wall Street financier and a French state bank divided the spoils. This was the human cost of the leverage. Black treated those lost pensions not as a tragedy, but as the necessary margin of his victory. For years, the secret held. The portage agreements remained hidden. The financial press hailed Leon Black as a visionary who had brilliantly timed the bottom of the market. He was untouchable, but the truth in the financial sector operates much like a submerged corpse. Eventually, the gases expand, and it floats to the surface. In the late 1990s, a French whistleblower, disgruntled over a separate business dispute, approached authorities and exposed the secret portage agreements. The revelation sent shockwaves through the global financial system. The United States Attorney in Los Angeles launched a massive, multi-year criminal investigation into the executive life buyout. The Federal Bureau of Investigation raided offices. Subpoenas flew across the Atlantic. The conspiracy was laid bare for the world to see. California regulators had been comprehensively defrauded by a coalition of foreign banks and Wall Street operatives. The legal fallout was catastrophic for the French. In December 2003, Crédit Lyonnais and the consortium of French entities agreed to plead guilty to criminal charges and pay a staggering $770 million in fines and settlement funds to the United States and the state of California. Several high-ranking French executives, including Jean-François Hénin, faced criminal indictments. The French government was deeply humiliated, forced to write massive checks to appease the American justice system. But what happened to the architect? What happened to the man who brought the deal to the French, who managed the assets, and who walked away with the lion's share of the operational profits? This is where we witness the terrifying efficacy of the Teflon shield Black had begun to construct. Despite being the primary American orchestrator of the portfolio management, Leon Black and Apollo Global Management entirely avoided criminal prosecution. The Department of Justice focused its criminal indictments primarily on the foreign entities that had explicitly signed the fraudulent ownership documents. Black's legal army argued that he was merely a financial advisor and asset manager, completely insulated from the deceptive regulatory field. Ings executed by his French partners. To make the civil inquiries disappear, Apollo and Leon Black quietly agreed to pay a reported $20 million to settle with the California Insurance Commissioner. $20 million. For a man who had utilized the deal to establish an empire managing hundreds of billions of dollars, this sum was not a penalty. It was a minor administrative fee. It was a rounding error. He had stood at the epicenter of one of the largest financial frauds of the 1990s. He had partnered with entities that subsequently pleaded guilty to criminal conspiracy. The policyholders had lost their life savings. The French executives had their careers destroyed and faced the threat of prison. Yet Leon Black walked out of the blast radius completely unscathed, exponentially wealthier, and more powerful than ever before. This specific historical event is crucial because it permanently cemented his psychological worldview. The executive life scandal taught Leon Black a deeply dangerous lesson. The law is merely a pricing mechanism. If the legal structure is complex enough, if the corporate veils are layered deep enough, and if the attorneys defending you are the most expensive in the world, you are effectively immune to the consequences of your actions. He learned that if the ultimate financial profit is $2 billion, a $20 million settlement is simply the cost of doing business. And that very habit, that deeply ingrained conviction that he could navigate the darkest, most legally treacherous waters and simply buy his way out of any resulting crisis, would become the operating system of his life. He believed he was entirely insulated from the rules that governed ordinary human conduct. He had beaten the junk bond collapse, and he had beaten the Department of Justice. With the foundational billions of executive life safely secured in Apollo's accounts, the raw, brutal power of his firm was undeniable. But money made from international SC, andal, and slashed pensions leaves a heavy, indelible residue. As the 1990s gave way to a new millennium, Black realized that while he had conquered the mechanics of wealth, he had not conquered the mechanics of prestige. The billionaires of the old guard still viewed him as a vulture who had picked the bones of a California insurance company. He possessed absolute financial power, but he lacked the one thing that could permanently shield him from his reputation: cultural immortality. And so, with his war chest overflowing, the apex predator of Wall Street turned his unblinking stare toward the pristine, heavily guarded institutions of high culture. The pivot from corporate raiding to art washing was about to begin in earnest, setting the stage for a dual life that would require an ever-expanding empire of silence to maintain. He was building a machine explicitly designed to feast on financial distress. The more desperate the seller, the more powerful Leon Black became. Instead of creating new products or technologies, he feasted on financial distress, restructuring the failures of others and taking a massive percentage of the salvaged wreckage. And in this dark, highly complex corner of finance, he became the undisputed master. He operated with a level of impunity that bordered on the imperial, realizing that if you control the debt, you control the destiny of the company. Up to this point, everything is still strictly within the bounds of aggressive American capitalism. He is simply playing the game better and colder than anyone else. Yet the problem with building an empire in the shadows of distressed debt is that eventually the sheer scale of the wealth demands public acknowledgement. As the billions began to pile up in the 1990s, outperforming almost every traditional asset class, the quiet, ruthless tactician of Wall Street realized a fundamental truth about American power. Raw financial brute force is not enough. Money, especially money made from the carcass, and says of bankrupt companies and the remnants of a disgraced era, carries a certain stench in the drawing rooms of the old establishment. He needed a shield. He needed respectability. Leon Black began to understand that to become truly untouchable, to insulate himself from the inevitable criticisms of his ruthless business practices, he could not simply remain a feared billionaire. He had to become a patrician. He had to wrap the cold, hard steel of his financial empire in the soft, unimpeachable velvet of high society philanthropy. He needed to buy a new identity. And to get it, he would have to step out of the shadows of the junk bond market and use his vast fortunes to purchase his way into the highest, most exclusive echelons of New York's cultural aristocracy. This pivot from corporate raider to refined patron of the arts would require a flawless, heavily guarded public facade, setting into motion a duality that would ultimately tear his world apart. The transition from the bloodless mathematical calculus of distressed debt to the gilded, heavily perfumed halls of high culture is not a natural evolution. It is a highly calculated, heavily financed acquisition. In the upper echelons of New York society, there is a specific unspoken mechanism used to sanitize fortunes built on the wreckage of others. It is a phenomenon known as art washing. For a man who had minted billions by profiting from corporate decay and the panicked liquidation of junk bonds, raw wealth was becoming a profound liability. It invited constant, aggressive scrutiny from regulators. It invited deep resentment from the old money establishment. the inheritors of steel and railroad fortunes, who viewed blacks' financial origins with aristocratic disdain. Leon Black understood a fundamental truth about American power: to become truly untouchable, to insulate himself from the inevitable moral criticisms of his ruthless business practices. He could not simply remain a feared financier. He had to be a patrician. He had to systematically acquire cultural capital with the exact same predatory precision he used to buy distressed corporate bonds. He did not merely collect art, he weaponized it. His ultimate target was not just any gallery, but the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the undisputed global epicenter of cultural prestige. To hold power at MoMA is to hold a master key to the most exclusive, impenetrable rooms in the world. It grants you proximity to visiting heads of state, to legacy media barons, and to the intellectual elite. Black did not just donate money to MoMA. He maneuvered through the museum's complex, deeply political hierarchy, like a corporate raider infiltrating a vulnerable board of directors. He deployed his vast wealth strategically, securing a seat on the board of trustees and gradually tightening his grip over the institution's direction. He was not satisfied with being a benefactor. He demanded to be the architect. The museum became his sanctuary and his armor. Behind its pristine white marble walls, the ruthless executive who had spent his mornings orchestrating mass layoffs was magically transformed into a refined, benevolent patron. He was buying a new identity, one multi-million-dollar canvas at a time. The contradiction between these two simultaneous lives is staggering, and it highlights the dramatic gap between what the character intends and what actually happens. The physical reality of his days during the late 1990s and early 2000s revealed a stark contradiction. In the morning, he sat in the sterile, heavily fortified, glass-enclosed conference rooms of Apollo Global Management. Here, his firm is orchestrating leverage buyouts that frequently result in fractured pension funds, the dismantling of regional businesses, and the brutal liquidation of American manufacturing facilities. He remains the silent, heavy, imposing presence at the head of the table, suffocating his opposition with his absolute refusal to speak, demand, in total humiliating submission from the companies Apollo consumes. Yet by evening, the physical manifestation of his psychological state seemingly shifts. He floats through the softly lit, champagne-drenched galleries of Manhattan. He speaks in hushed, reverent tones about post-impressionist brushstrokes to foreign dignitaries and tech billionaires. The public sees a sophisticated intellectual, a guardian of human expression. But if you were to watch him closely at a high-stakes Sotheby's or Christie's auction, the illusion shatters entirely. The physical posture is identical to his boardroom demeanor. There is the same unblinking reptilian stare, the same subtle commanding nod to outbid a panicked rival. He does not gaze at a masterpiece with the sweeping emotional passion of a romantic art lover. He looks at it as a conquered asset. He seeks submission from the canvas just as he seeks it from a bankrupt CEO. He is a man desperate to curate his own image just as rigidly and ruthlessly as he curates his private collections. Every painting he acquires is another brick in the wall, separating his public persona from his ruthless business practices. This obsession with controlling the narrative eventually expanded beyond simply hanging prestigious paintings on the walls of his sprawling estates. Leon Black recognized that whoever controls the history books controls the truth. In a move that perfectly encapsulates his psychological need for total dominance, He went on to acquire Phaidon, one of the world's most renowned and respected publishers of books on the visual arts. This was not a standard financial investment. It was a masterstroke of reputation management, a brilliant, terrifying tactical maneuver. By owning the literal printing presses that document and dictate art history, he entrenched himself even deeper into the bedrock of cultural authority. He was no longer just a participant in the elite art world. He was its landlord. He had constructed a flawless, aristocratic facade, a fortress of high culture that rendered him practically immune to the moral criticisms frequently leveled at ordinary Wall Street billionaires. He was, in effect, purchasing immunity from public judgment. Up to this point, everything is still ostensibly okay in the eyes of the law and high society. He is playing the brutal game of American capitalism at its absolute highest, most aggressive level, and he is winning on every front. He has built the ultimate fortress. The public sees exactly what he has paid them to see. The visionary investor, the cultured philanthropist, the untouchable chairman. He is the man who saved the junk bond market and the man who guards the Picassos. But the problem with constructing a life entirely out of heavily guarded compartments is the immense psychological pressure required to keep them separate. The dual life of Leon Black was a masterpiece of compartmentalization, but it was fundamentally unnatural. The issue isn't what he bought to protect his image. The issue is how the sheer weight of that image began to distort his reality. A fortress built on the obsession with absolute control requires constant, meticulous, and exhausting maintenance. The public facade was pristine, polished to a blinding shine, but the private mechanics of managing a rapidly expanding fortune of this magnitude required a different set of tools. When a man reaches Black's level of wealth, ascending past the billions and into the tens of billions, he does not simply use a local bank or a standard accounting firm. He creates a family office. In the ultra-wealthy sphere, a family office is a private wealth management advisory firm that serves a single high-net-worth individual. It manages investments, offshore trusts, tax evasion strategies, and labyrinthine legal structures. But more importantly, a family office manages secrets. It is the designated vault for the transactions that the public, and often the regulators, must never see. The impenetrable insulation Black had built to protect his gilded cultural reputation was quietly creating a dark, silent vacuum in his private affairs. He was running a massive, publicly scrutinized financial empire at Apollo that required strict regulatory compliance and public-facing efficiency. But managing the sprawling labyrinth of his personal wealth, his private appetites, and his deeply guarded personal life required an operator who existed entirely outside the boundaries of polite society. The higher Black climbed in the cultural stratosphere, the more terrifying the prospect of a fall became. He needed a shadow manager for his shadow life. He needed someone who understood absolute, unquestioning discretion. He needed a fixer who moved seamlessly through the worlds of high finance and elite society, but who was not bound by the restrictive compliance departments, the ethical oversight, or the moral compass of a massive firm like Apollo. He believed his wealth elevated him above consequence. This arrogance created a dangerous dependency on unregulated operators to manage his private affairs. He believed that his money had elevated him above consequence. He believed that the walls of MoMA and the billions at Apollo had made him an untouchable sovereign entity. As the new millennium progressed, the applause at the museum galas grew louder, and the profits at his firm grew exponentially. Leon Black was at the absolute zenith of his power. He had successfully buried the ruthless junk bond trader of the 1980s beneath layers of bespoke suits and philanthropic awards. But the plot twist is in the shadows. While he was busy shaking hands with royalty and acquiring the physical manifestations of high culture, a door was quietly opening in the background of his meticulously controlled life. He had built a machine that required an endless supply of silence to function, and soon he would find the perfect architect for that silence. The stage was now set for the introduction of a figure who would eventually torch the entire gilded empire to the ground. And this is where things really get dirty. Through that door stepped a man who possessed no formal financial qualifications, no university degree, and no legitimate institutional backing. Yet, inexplicably, he managed the most intimate private affairs of the world's most powerful billionaires. His name was Jeffrey Epstein. The sheer absurdity of the alliance that followed stands in stark contrast to the architectural structure of Apollo Global Management. Leon Black had constructed a financial citadel staffed by the sharpest, most ruthless mathematical minds on the planet. He employed hundreds of analysts holding advanced degrees from Harvard, Wharton, and Oxford. If Black required a sophisticated tax strategy, an estate plan, or a complex offshore trust, he had the resources to hire the most prestigious, legally bulletproof law firms in the world. He could command the absolute pinnacle of legitimate financial architecture with a single phone call. Yet the man pulling the strings of an $800 billion empire bypassed all of his Ivy League experts for his most sensitive personal matters. Instead, he handed the keys to his private treasury to a man who, by the time their financial entanglement reached its peak, was already a convicted and registered sex offender. While billionaires cross paths constantly in Manhattan and Palm Beach, the staggering, unprecedented volume of capital that flowed between Black and Epstein reveals a profound psychological shift, a control-obsessed titan actively outsourcing his secrets to a predator. In 2008, Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty to procuring a minor for prostitution in Florida. He served a notoriously lenient sentence, but the public record was permanently, indelibly stained. He was officially, legally designated as a sexual predator. For the vast majority of the corporate world, Epstein instantly became radioactive. Wall Street, banks systematically severed ties. Politicians quietly returned donations. Survival in the corporate sphere dictated complete distance. But for Leon Black, the relationship did not end. Astonishingly, according to an independent review later conducted by the international law firm DeShare LLP, the financial relationship actually accelerated. Between 2012 and 2017, years after Epstein's criminal conviction, Black authorized a series of wire transfers to accounts controlled by Epstein. The total sum was an astronomical $158 million. $158 million is not a standard consulting fee. It is a transfer of generational wealth. It is a sum larger than the annual operating budgets of many small nations. Black's official explanation, maintained fiercely throughout subsequent investigations by the United States Senate Finance Committee, was that Epstein provided incredibly valuable trust and estate planning and tax advice. According to Black's defense, Epstein's labyrinthine financial structures, particularly those involving grantor-retained annuity trusts, or GRATs, saved the Black family hundreds of millions of dollars in future tax liabilities. We are asked to believe that a man who built a career outsmarting the most sophisticated corporate boards on earth, a man whose entire professional existence was defined by ruthless risk management and strict legal compliance, was completely oblivious to the catastrophic reputational risk of financing a known predator. We are asked to believe that the smartest, most paranoid man in the room was simply taking tax advice from a disgraced college dropout. The reality of power suggests something far more insidious. Epstein did not sell standard financial advice. He sold a commodity far more valuable to a man afflicted by a pathological need for total control. Epstein sold absolute, unquestioning, boundaryless secrecy. He operated in a shadow dimension of finance where regulatory compliance was non-existent and moral questions were never asked. For a man like Black, whose public life at Apollo and MoMA was heavily policed by the Securities and Exchange Commission and elite social expectations, Epstein's private network offered a deeply appealing, unregulated sandbox. He paid $158 million, not just for tax loopholes, but for a dark financial concierge. He was, intentionally or not, underwriting the vast infrastructure of Epstein's life, funding the very enterprise that allowed the predator to maintain his private islands, his fleets of aircraft, and his Manhattan townhouse. And it is precisely during this era of massive secret wire transfers that we witness a moment that perfectly crystallizes the bizarre, twisted psychology of Leon Black. It is an event that serves as a glaring psychological tell, a physical manifestation of a mind buckling under its own contradictions. In May of 2012, right as the millions were beginning to flow from Black's accounts to Epstein's, Sotheby's in New York auctioned one of the most universally recognizable images in human history, Edvard Munch's masterpiece, The Scream. The auction room was a tense, sweaty theater of extreme wealth and fragile egos. The bidding war was fierce, climbing tens of millions of dollars in mere seconds. And then the gavel fell. The winning bid was an astronomical $119.9 million. The buyer, operating through a telephone proxy to maintain his beloved secrecy, was eventually revealed to be Leon Black. Why the scream? Out of all the beautiful, serene, or triumphant pieces of art in the world, why did a man who spent his entire adult life ruthlessly suppressing public emotion spend nearly $120 million on the ultimate visual representation of existential panic? It is a deeply tragic contradiction. Here is a man whose daily professional life is devoid of human empathy, a man who inflicts deep financial anxiety upon thousands of workers through his corporate raids, yet he is compelled to own the physical embodiment of terror. He possesses the scream, but he ensures his own world remains perfectly, terrifyingly silent. It is as if he is trying to purchase and lock away the very anxiety he creates. He wants to own panic, to put it in a gilded frame and control it completely. He buys the ultimate symbol of human distress for his private collection, while simultaneously funneling $158 million to a man who trades in human distress in the shadows. His fatal weakness, the belief that everything, even human terror and the darkest secrets, can be bought and managed, was now operating at maximum capacity. Up to this point, everything is still ostensibly a matter of aggressive tax evasion and poor judgment. The public still sees the philanthropic titan. The art world still bows to the owner of the scream. But that very habit of believing he could purchase impunity was quietly building a bomb beneath his empire. While the financial ledgers showed cold clinical transactions, The reality of what was occurring within the orbit of Jeffrey Epstein was anything but clinical. The narrative is about to violently fracture, shifting from the sterile realm of offshore tax havens and art auctions into a deeply harrowing human reality. As the years ticked toward the end of the decade, the heavy fortified oak doors of Jeffrey Epstein's Upper East Side townhouse were holding back a tide of catastrophic allegations. Behind those doors, the sterile money Black had wired was allegedly facilitating a world of unimaginable cruelty. And this is where the story pivots from a tale of financial irregularities into a terrifying examination of human atrocities. Because when Epstein was finally arrested again in 2019, sparking a global reckoning, the vault of Leon Black's private life was blown wide open. What emerged from the wreckage were not just tax documents. What emerged were the voices of survivors, represented by aggressive civil law firms carrying sworn affidavits that would paint a portrait of the billionaire so violently at odds with his aristocratic facade, it would shatter his world forever. And the things described in those legal documents would reveal exactly how a god of Wall Street truly views those he believes he controls. The summer of 2019 fundamentally altered the trajectory of the American elite. When federal agents finally breached the heavy doors of Jeffrey Epstein's Manhattan townhouse, they did not just arrest a prolific predator, they detonated a bomb in the center of high society. As Epstein sat in a federal holding cell, the blast radius of his exposure began to expand rapidly outward, scorching the reputations of politicians, royalty, and Wall Street titans. For Leon Black, this was the moment the meticulously constructed firewall between his public philanthropy and his private financial entanglements began to crack. Initially, the scrutiny focused on the cold, hard mathematics we have already examined, the staggering $158 million in wire transfers. But money is ultimately just paper. The true existential threat to Black's gilded empire did not emerge from bank ledgers or tax documents. It emerged from the voices of the survivors. As the Epstein scandal exploded into a global reckoning, aggressive civil law firms began to pry open the vault of Black's heavily guarded private life. The narrative violently shifted from the sterile realm of offshore tax havens into a deeply harrowing human reality. Leading the charge was the law firm Wigdor LLP, representing multiple plaintiffs who filed devastating civil lawsuits against the billionaire. The names of these women, including Sherry Pearson and another identified in court documents as Jane Doe, became permanent fixtures on the public docket. These civil complaints bypassed the corporate veil of Apollo Global Management entirely and struck directly at the man himself. The sworn testimony describe incidents occurring primarily within the suffocating, highly controlled environment of Epstein's New York mansion, specifically during the years when Black was simultaneously rising to the absolute pinnacle of the cultural world. The civil records do not merely accuse Black of passive participation in Epstein's sordid orbit. They allege acts of severe calculated cruelty. According to the court documents, the plaintiffs detailed harrowing encounters involving sadistic behavior, aggressive coercion, and physical injury. They describe a dynamic where vulnerable individuals were allegedly subjected to a terrifying asymmetry of power. It is crucial to state unequivocally that Leon Black has vehemently, consistently, and aggressively denied all of these allegations. Through his legal representatives, he has categorically stated that any encounters were entirely consensual. He has repeatedly framed the civil lawsuits as malicious, extortionate attempts to extract a massive financial settlement from a wealthy man who simply had the misfortune of being caught in the blast radius of the Epstein media frenzy. A profound, almost grotesque duality defined his existence during these years. On a Tuesday evening, he is standing in the grand atrium of the Museum of Modern Art, a beacon of refined civilization, smiling softly for the cameras as a benefactor of humanity, passionately funding the preservation of human expression. Yet, according to the civil complaints, mere days later he is walking through the fortified doors of a townhouse designed for human exploitation, allegedly engaging in acts of devastating physical domination. The gap between how the public perceived him and the hidden reality described in these legal filings is breathtaking. This was the exact moment his fatal weakness, his insatiable need for absolute control, mutated from a corporate strategy into a personal catastrophe. When faced with these horrific allegations, Black did not respond with introspection or public contrition. He responded exactly the way he had responded to every crisis since the collapse of Drexel Burnham Lambert. He viewed the allegations not as a moral failing, but as a breach of contract. He appeared to view the women speaking out not as human beings carrying profound trauma, but as hostile corporate liabilities that needed to be aggressively liquidated. He believed he could manage this human crisis just as he managed distressed debt. When a titan with limitless resources decides to go to war, he deploys the darkest, most oppressive tools of the financial sector against individual citizens. Black reached into his vast arsenal and prepared to drown his accusers in a tsunami of legal threats. Central to this strategy was the weaponization of the non-disclosure agreement. In the realm of corporate buyouts, an NDA is a routine mechanism to protect trade secrets and financial data during a merger. But in the hands of a billionaire facing allegations of profound personal misconduct, the NDA morphs into an instrument of terror. It becomes a psychological cage built entirely out of complex legal jargon in the threat of catastrophic financial penalties, designed to isolate, silence, and paralyze. A survivor attempting to speak out against a man of this magnitude faces the sheer mechanical violence of modern capital. You are not just facing one individual, you are facing an institution. A sudden knock at the door brings a heavy stack of legal injunctions delivered by a private process server. Your daily life is suddenly subjected to the scrutiny of private investigators hired to unearth any vulnerability in your past that could be leveraged in court. Your inbox is flooded with correspondence from elite attorneys who bill more per hour than most people earn in a month. The language in these documents is deliberately dense, terrifyingly punitive, and laced with the implicit threat of total financial ruin if you dare to utter his name publicly. This is the sheer mechanical violence of modern capital. Black's legal machinery was deployed to create a total vacuum of silence, attempting to grind the plaintiffs down through sheer financial attrition. Simultaneously, Black launched an aggressive public relations counteroffensive. He hired elite crisis management firms, the kind of shadowy operatives who specialize in burying negative search engine results, planting favorable narratives in financial journals, and shaping public perception. The narrative they attempted to spin was a masterpiece of corporate audacity. They sought to portray a man worth over $10 billion, a man who sits on the boards of hospitals and museums, as the tragic victim of a vast opportunistic conspiracy. They demanded that the public view him not as a ruthless architect of financial distress, but as a naive philanthropist who had simply been tricked by Jeffrey Epstein's financial wizardry and was now being unfairly targeted by greedy litigators. It is a fascinating psychological phenomenon. He demanded absolute submission from everyone in his professional life, yet when cornered by his own actions, he attempted to claim the mantle of a helpless victim. He fundamentally believed that every accuser was simply an unpriced asset, a nuisance that could be managed, bought out, or legally intimidated into submission. He was trying to execute a hostile takeover of the truth. But the world was no longer buying the illusion. Up to this point, he had been fighting a personal war, attempting to keep the fallout contained within the civil courts and the gossip columns. He believed his legal firewall was holding, but he forgot the fundamental rule of the empire he had built. Apollo Global Management was not a private piggy bank. It was a publicly traded behemoth that required a constant, massive influx of fresh capital to survive. And the capital that fueled Apollo did not come from other billionaires. It came from the public. And this is why the narrative shifts from a sordid personal scandal into a systemic corporate catastrophe. As the grotesque details of the civil suits and the staggering $158 million payments hit the front pages of the financial press, a tremor ran through the global markets. The billions of dollars that Black managed originated in large part from public pension funds, the retirement savings of public school teachers, firefighters, and municipal workers across the globe. These were the institutions paying the exorbitant management fees that funded Black's extraordinary lifestyle. And pension fund managers, while generally indifferent to Wall Street ruthlessness, are highly allergic to toxic public relations. A firewall built of NDAs might silence an individual survivor, but it cannot silence a teachers' union demanding to know why their retirement money is enriching a man embroiled in a horrific abuse scandal. The money was getting nervous. And in Leon Black's world, when the money gets nervous, the real bloodletting begins. The cultural aristocracy of New York operates on a currency far more delicate and far more volatile than the brute mathematics of Wall Street. It operates on perception, on prestige, and on the heavily guarded illusion of moral elevation. For over 2 decades, Leon Black had used his immense junk bond-derived wealth to purchase his standing within this elite world, ultimately securing the most coveted prize in Manhattan, the chairmanship of the Museum of Modern Art. He fundamentally believed that the pristine walls of MoMA, built on the historic patronage of the ultra-rich, would provide an impenetrable permanent sanctuary from the sordid allegations now spilling out of the financial press. He viewed the museum as a fortress that his money had rendered invincible. But in this assumption, he made a catastrophic miscalculation. He viewed artists and curators merely as the beneficiaries of his financial generosity, failing to realize that cultural where ultimately rests on public sentiment and moral zeitgeist, not just private endowments. The revolt was swift, highly organized, and devastatingly public. It did not originate from rival billionaires, corporate raiders, or hostile board members. It erupted from the very artists whose work hung on the walls he purportedly governed. A coalition of over 150 prominent artists, curators, and cultural figures signed a searing open letter demanding his immediate removal from the MoMA board. The letter was a profound, unvarnished indictment, unequivocally stating that a man deeply financially entangled with a notorious convicted predator had absolutely no place leading a global institution of culture. They argued that his presence was a toxic stain on the legacy of modern art. The visceral, physical humiliation of that moment was devastating for a man obsessed with absolute control. The very people he had spent hundreds of millions of dollars to associate with, the people whose creative output he had used for decades to sanitize his ruthless corporate image, were now publicly branding him as radioactive. He was no longer the benevolent patrician. He was the contagion. The aristocratic facade he had meticulously constructed layer by layer, canvas by canvas, over 20 years, was collapsing in real time. Behind the scenes, the elite social circles of Manhattan executed a brutal, silent purge. In high society, exile is rarely announced. It is simply enacted through absence. The heavy cream-colored invitations to the exclusive diamond-drenched galas abruptly stopped arriving. The private candlelit dinners in Upper East Side townhouses no longer included his name on the carefully curated guest lists. The broader philanthropic world, which had spent years eagerly, almost sycophantically cashing his checks, suddenly treated his money as a moral hazard. This is the terrifying phenomenon of social death among the ultra-wealthy. His bank accounts remained lush with billions, his net worth untouched by the cultural boycott, but his cultural capital was entirely irrevocably liquidated. The pressure mounted until it became structurally unbearable for the museum. In a move that mirrored his humiliating exit from Apollo, but carried a much deeper, more personal sting, Black was forced to step down from the chairmanship of MoMA. He did not choose to retreat. His continued presence threatened to destroy the museum's fundraising apparatus and its relationship with the global art community. When he relinquished that seat, the severance was complete. The financial world had amputated him to save its stock price, and the cultural world had amputated him to save its soul. He was left entirely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of public judgment, stripped of all his institutional armor. But the final crushing blow to his legacy did not come from an art gallery or a corporate boardroom. It came from the cold, unyielding, and terrifyingly precise machinery of the legal system. In early 2023, the government of the United States Virgin Islands, the jurisdiction where Jeffrey Epstein had operated his infamous, heavily guarded private island, announced a staggering civil settlement. Leon Black agreed to pay $62.5 million to be released from any potential claims related to the territory's sprawling investigation into Epstein's criminal enterprise. Black's legal team immediately deployed to control the narrative, heavily emphasizing that the settlement was emphatically not an admission of legal liability. They maintained his long-standing, unwavering defense that he was entirely unaware of the criminal activities, that he was horrified by Epstein's conduct, and that he was simply paying this exorbitant sum to avoid the astronomical costs and the devastating public spectacle of a protracted, multi-year legal battle. However, we must look past the sanitized, carefully vetted language of corporate defense attorneys and examine the structural reality of this transaction. Official filings surrounding the broader investigations into Epstein's finances suggested a horrifying systemic dynamic. The exorbitant, unprecedented fees Black paid for supposed tax advice had provided a massive, sustained influx of capital that inadvertently helped fund the logistical operations of Epstein's dark empire. The $62.5 million settlement was the ultimate tragic manifestation of Black's fatal weakness. Once again, at the very end of his reign, He was attempting to use a massive deployment of capital to purchase silence. He was trying to buy his way out of a profound human crisis, to place a neat, quantifiable financial cap on a moral catastrophe. He was using the staggering wealth generated by his distressed debt empire to settle the final devastating debts of his own deeply compromised judgment. A titan of Wall Street financing a predator without triggering a single alarm bell within his own $800 billion empire required a specific architecture. It existed far away from the public balance sheets of Apollo Global Management, within a much darker, entirely unregulated financial mechanism, the vault. As Leon Black transitioned from the ruthless king of distressed debt into the refined, untouchable chairman of the Museum of Modern Art, his personal wealth was compounding at a rate that defied standard financial gravity. He was no longer just a billionaire. He was ascending into the ranks of the deca-billionaires. But with that staggering level of wealth comes a profound, almost paranoid, psychological burden. When a man reaches a net worth that rivals the GDP of a small nation, his primary existential threat is no longer a bad investment or a market crash. His primary enemy is the Internal Revenue Service. This brings us to the architecture of extreme, isolated wealth. A man of black stature does not walk into a high street bank, nor does he rely solely on the wealth management divisions of traditional Wall Street firms. Those institutions are regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. They have compliance officers, mandatory reporting laws, and a paper trail. For a man whose fatal weakness is the pathological need for absolute control and total secrecy, a regulated bank is a vulnerability. Instead, he utilizes a mechanism exclusive to the ultra-rich, the family office. In Leon Black's case, this entity was known as Elysius Management. Elysius operates behind unmarked, heavily fortified doors in elite Manhattan office buildings. It is a private, unregulated financial fortress dedicated to serving exactly one client. It manages his offshore trust, his sprawling real estate portfolio, his multi-million-dollar art acquisitions, and, most importantly, his tax avoidance strategies. Apollo Global Management was the brutal public-facing engine that generated the billions. But Elysius Management was the silent black box vault where those billions were hidden. And it is precisely here, within the unmonitored shadows of the family office, that the fatal intersection with Jeffrey Epstein occurred. The profound contradiction of this arrangement is staggering. At Apollo, Leon Black was a notoriously demanding micromanager. He employed armies of the sharpest, most highly credentialed financial analysts from Harvard and Wharton. Every leveraged buyout was subjected to excruciating forensic due diligence. If an Apollo executive wanted to allocate capital, they had to survive a boardroom interrogation led by Black himself, enduring his suffocating silences and his unblinking predatory stare. Yet, when it came to his own personal treasury at Elysius, the man obsessed with control handed the keys to a ghost. He bypassed the finest legal minds in the world and installed Jeffrey Epstein, a college dropout with no formal accounting degree, no law license, and a felony conviction for soliciting a minor, as his ultimate financial whisperer. The findings of the United States Senate Finance Committee exposed the sheer mechanics of this grotesque alliance. In 2022 and 2023, the committee, armed with subpoena power, began to aggressively pry open the black box of Leon Black's taxes. What the Senate investigators discovered was not a casual advisory relationship. It was a deeply enmeshed, highly systemic financial marriage designed to subvert the American tax code on a monumental scale. According to the Senate probe, Epstein's primary utility to Black revolved around an obscure, highly complex financial instrument known as a grantor-retained annuity trust, or a GRAT. The devil is entirely in the details of the GRAT. In simple terms, this instrument is a legal loophole used by the ultra-wealthy to transfer massive amounts of money to their heirs without paying the United States government the statutory estate or gift taxes. You place assets like Apollo stock into a trust. If the stock explodes in value, the excess profit goes to your children entirely tax-free. The Senate Finance Committee found that Epstein claimed to be the mastermind behind structuring these incredibly aggressive GRATs for the Black family. Epstein allegedly identified billions of dollars in potential tax savings, and for this service, Epstein did not charge a standard hourly lawyer's fee. He operated on a terrifyingly lucrative structure. He demanded a percentage of the wealth he shielded from the IRS. This is the cold forensic origin of the $158 million. It was not a single inexplicable wire transfer. It was a systematic multi-year siphoning of capital. The Senate investigation detailed how Epstein pushed for and received a staggeringly unprecedented retainer. The investigators raised severe, alarming questions about the legitimacy of these payments, pointing out that Epstein's advice often involved aggressively pushing the legal boundaries of tax avoidance to the absolute breaking point. The psychological profile this paints of Leon Black is devastating. The mindset of a titan engaging in this behavior reveals a chilling hypocrisy. Here was a man who built his empire by ruthlessly extracting every possible cent from distressed, bankrupt American companies. He is a man who will relentlessly slash the pensions of blue-collar workers to maximize his profit margins. He refuses to leave a single dollar on the negotiating table. He fights the Internal Revenue Service with the ferocity of a cornered animal, deploying every loophole conceivable to avoid contributing to the public infrastructure that allowed his empire to exist in the first place. Yet this exact same man who pinches pennies in the boardroom and starves the public tax coffers willingly, repeatedly, and quietly wires $158 million to a known, convicted sexual predator. He pays a premium for the dark arts. He believes that by utilizing a disgraced, unregulated operative like Epstein, he is demonstrating superior intellect. He believes he is outsmarting the system. But this arrogant reliance on the shadows created a massive structural vulnerability. Black fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man he was financing. He viewed Epstein merely as an unpriced asset, a highly effective, albeit unsavory tax mechanic. Black's fatal flaw was the belief that financial leverage equates to absolute control over a human being. He thought he was buying Epstein's financial acumen. In reality, he was binding himself to a ticking time bomb, because Epstein was not just moving paper around in offshore trusts. Epstein was utilizing the staggering wealth generated by men like Leon Black to construct a sprawling international apparatus of human exploitation. The millions of dollars flowing out of the pristine silent accounts of Elysius Management were quietly washing into the accounts that fueled Epstein's private jets, maintained his heavily fortified island in the Aita, U.S. Virgin Islands, and funded the vast network of recruiters who preyed upon vulnerable young women. This is the true horrifying consequence of his policies. When a billionaire sets up a shadow financial architecture designed to evade all regulatory oversight, he creates a vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped an entirely unregulated illicit enterprise. The insulation Black built to protect his money became the exact same insulation that protected Epstein's crimes. For years, the vault remained sealed. The GRATs performed perfectly. The IRS was kept at bay. The public continued to applaud Black's massive donations to MoMA, entirely unaware that the man funding the preservation of post-impressionist masterpieces was simultaneously funding the architect of a sprawling criminal enterprise. The duality was perfectly balanced, but a vault built on a foundation of tax evasion and dark money is inherently unstable. The pressure from the outside world was beginning to mount. While Black was admiring his newly purchased Edvard Munch painting, the survivors of Epstein's abuse were beginning to organize. They were finding aggressive legal representation. They were preparing to shatter the silence. The collision was inevitable. The sterile, highly mathematical world of the family office, where human beings are reduced to tax liabilities and offshore trusts, was about to be violently invaded by the messy, undeniable, and devastating reality of human trauma. The $158 million that Black had paid to secure his legacy was about to become the very evidence used to dismantle it. And when the heavy, fortified doors of the vault were finally kicked open by the civil justice system, the billionaire would realize that the absolute control he had spent his entire life cultivating was nothing more than an illusion. The machinery of his own wealth was about to turn against him, setting the stage for a spectacular, highly public corporate mutiny that would leave the god of Wall Street entirely alone. The breach of the Elysius management vault was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing unraveling of a meticulously constructed life. For years, Leon Black had successfully quarantined his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein within the sterile, highly technical boundaries of tax advice and estate planning. He believed that his battalion of lawyers had successfully contained the fallout to the realm of financial irregularities, but he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the storm that was gathering. The existential threat to his empire was never going to come from an IRS audit or a Senate subpoena regarding grantor retained annuity trusts. The true threat was human. It was the messy, undeniable, and profoundly traumatizing reality of the survivors who refused to be erased from the ledger. The dam officially broke with the filing of highly detailed, devastating civil lawsuits. The absolute shockwave these filings sent through the American financial establishment was triggered by a specific legal mechanism. In late 2022, the state of New York enacted the Adult Survivors Act, a temporary legal window that allowed survivors of sexual offenses to file civil suits even if the statute of limitations had long expired. For a man like Leon Black, who had spent decades relying on the passage of time and the enforcement of non-disclosure agreements to bury his secrets, this new law was catastrophic. It bypassed his financial defenses and struck directly at his legacy. Leading the charge was the aggressive litigation firm Wigdor LLP, a firm known for taking on deeply entrenched corporate power. They filed complaints on behalf of multiple women, most notably Sherry Pearson, and another plaintiff identified in the sprawling court docket simply as Jane Doe. When these documents were processed and made public, they did not read like dry corporate litigation. They read like a horror story, dragging the god of Wall Street out of a boardroom and into the darkest corners of human depravity. Viewed with a cold prosecutorial eye, the contents of these filings placed devastating allegations strictly on the public record. The sworn testimonies bypass the abstract numbers of the Epstein scandal and root the narrative in a specific physical space. Jeffrey Epstein's notorious Upper East Side townhouse. The plaintiffs describe arriving at this heavily fortified, aggressively opulent mansion, a place specifically designed to isolate and intimidate, and it is within these walls, according to the complaints, that the polished, philanthropic facade of Leon Black entirely dissolved. The allegations are horrifying in their specificity. Sherry Pearson's lawsuit, for instance, alleges that in the early 2000s, she was directed to a massage table in Epstein's residence. The complaint states that Leon Black, a man towering in physical stature and radiating absolute financial authority, entered the room and subjected her to severe, excruciating pain. The civil records do not describe a momentary lapse in judgment. They allege calculated, sadistic behavior, aggressive coercion, and a total disregard for human autonomy. They describe a dynamic where vulnerable women were treated identically to the distressed corporations Apollo Global Management routinely devoured, as objects to be pinned down, stripped of their power, leveraged, and ultimately discarded. Black's response to this new wave of lawsuits was not a retreat, but a brutal escalation, maintaining his fierce insistence that all encounters were consensual and the lawsuits were purely extortionate. He unleashed the full mechanical violence of modern capital. When confronted with these allegations, the true nature of his power was revealed. A titan with a $15 billion war chest does not retreat. He fights back. When Leon Black was cornered, his fatal weakness, his pathological need for absolute unyielding control, took over. He did not respond with the introspection, and he certainly did not respond with quiet contrition. He responded with the overwhelming mechanical violence of modern capital. He viewed the plaintiffs not as human beings carrying profound, unhealed trauma, but as hostile corporate liabilities that needed to be aggressively and publicly liquidated. He did not merely hire defense attorneys. He built a legal war room. He retained the most feared, expensive, and aggressive litigators in the country. He filed explosive counter lawsuits. He attempted to turn the legal system back upon his accusers, utilizing the Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO statute, a law originally designed to dismantle the mafia, to accuse the women and their lawyers of engaging in a criminal conspiracy to extort him. The psychological audacity of this strategy was staggering. Here was a man whose net worth was larger than the GDP of dozens of sovereign nations. A man who commands private jets, sprawling estates, and the ear of global politicians. Yet, in the pages of his legal filings, he attempted to paint himself as the tragic, helpless victim of a vast opportunistic shakedown orchestrated by single women. It is a breathtaking display of narcissistic reversal. He demanded that the world view the architect of ruthless Wall Street takeovers as a naive, bullied philanthropist. This counterattack was not simply about winning a court case. It was a strategy of psychological annihilation. This is the weaponization of wealth at its most terrifying. Imagine the sensory reality for a survivor standing on the other side of this legal bombardment. You are a private citizen. Suddenly, your life is subjected to the forensic scrutiny of private investigators hired to unearth any vulnerability, any past mistake, any financial distress that could be weaponized against you in a deposition. Your attorneys are buried under an avalanche of aggressive motions and procedural delays designed specifically to bleed you dry financially. The message Black was sending was not just to his current accusers, but to anyone else who might be waiting in the shadows. If you speak my name, I will dedicate a fraction of my infinite resources to ensuring your complete destruction. Central to this infrastructure of fear was his historical reliance on the non-disclosure agreement. In the world of high finance, an NDA is a standard, bloodless tool used to protect trade secrets during a merger. But Leon Black had spent decades perfecting the NDA as an instrument of interpersonal terror. It is a psychological cage built entirely out of complex legal jargon. An NDA isolates the victim, legally forbidding them from speaking to the press, to their colleagues, and sometimes even to their own families, under the threat of catastrophic financial ruin. Black fundamentally believed that every human crisis possessed a clearing price. He believed that if he layered enough NDAs over his past and enforced them with enough legal brutality, the truth could be permanently sealed in a vault. But Black's reliance on this aggressive, scorched earth strategy revealed a fatal misunderstanding of the modern cultural landscape. In the boardrooms of the 1990s, sheer financial terror always won. If you threatened to bankrupt a rival firm, they surrendered. But the hashtag #MeToo era and the post-Epstein reckoning had fundamentally altered the physics of public relations. His aggressive counter-lawsuits did not silence the narrative. They acted as an accelerant. By suing his accusers, by claiming extortion, and by dragging the fight into the open dockets of the federal court system, he inadvertently guaranteed that the horrific details of his alleged conduct remained on the front pages of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Financial Times day after day, month after month. He was suffering from a massive self-inflicted case of the Streisand effect. His desperate, flailing attempts to control the story were the exact mechanism broadcasting his darkest secrets to the world. The contrast was becoming too grotesque for polite society to ignore. The public was constantly presented with a split-screen reality. On one side, the aristocratic chairman of MoMA, the man who spent $119 million to possess the iconic painting The Scream. On the other side, the sworn affidavits describing a man who allegedly inflicted unimaginable terror in the soundproofed rooms of a convicted predator's mansion. The gilded mask was not just slipping, it was being violently torn off and trampled. And as the terrifying details of the Wigdor LLP lawsuits saturated the financial press, the scandal finally breached the heavily fortified, soundproofed walls of his financial empire. Up to this point, the institutional investors, the massive public pension funds that provided the billions of dollars Apollo Global Management used to execute its corporate raids, had remained quietly on the sidelines. They were generally indifferent to the personal lives of the billionaires who managed their money so long as the returns remained consistently high. But money is inherently cowardly. It hates noise, it hates volatility, and above all, it hates toxic public relations. A firewall built of NDAs and aggressive counter-lawsuits might successfully paralyze an individual survivor, but it possesses absolutely no power over a teachers' union in Pennsylvania, demanding to know why their retirement savings are enriching a man embroiled in a horrific, highly publicized sexual abuse scandal. The institutional capital that fueled his entire existence was beginning to freeze. The limited partners were watching the brutal legal war unfold, and they were quietly, decisively pulling their money back from the table. The master of leverage was about to discover what happens when the ultimate leverage, the capital itself, is turned against him. The ultimate financial reckoning began in total silence on the glowing G screens of Bloomberg terminals. By late autumn of 2020, Apollo Global Management entered a state of acute institutional paralysis. This $800 billion Leviathan functions as an apex predator, requiring a constant influx of capital to breathe. It survives on a relentless cycle of fundraising, perpetually asking institutional investors to lock up billions of dollars for years at a time. Apollo uses this money to orchestrate massive corporate buyouts, extracts exorbitant management fees, and eventually returns the profits. It is a delicate ecosystem built entirely on institutional trust. But when the horrific, graphic details of the civil suits and the staggering payments to a convicted predator saturated the financial media, the trust evaporated. The limited partners simply stopped answering the phone. This is the phenomenon known on Wall Street as a capital strike. In the high-stakes, heavily sanitized world of alternative asset management, an institutional investor will rarely call a press conference to denounce a founder. They do not engage in moral grandstanding. They simply close their checkbooks. The Pennsylvania Public School Employees Retirement System, a massive bellwether institutional backer, publicly halted all new commitments to Apollo's flagship funds. Other sovereign wealth funds, university endowments, and municipal pension boards across Europe and Asia quietly followed suit. The firm's stock price began to violently fluctuate. The blinking red numbers on the trading desks of their Manhattan headquarters signaled a terrifying new reality. Leon Black, the undisputed architect of the firm's historic success, the man who had generated unparalleled wealth for 3 decades, was no longer its greatest asset. He had become an existential radioactive threat to its survival. Inside the glass-walled boardrooms of Apollo's headquarters, located high above the city in the iconic Solo building at 9 West 57th Street, the atmosphere turned vino. Mouse. For 30 years, the internal hierarchy of the firm had operated as an absolute, unquestioned monarchy. Leon Black sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table, flanked by his brilliant, hyper-competent co-founders, Mark Rowan and Josh Harris. For decades, they had deferred to Black's silent, dominating authority. They had executed his complex visions, absorbed his suffocating silences, and helped him build the machine that made them all billionaires. But private equity is a realm entirely devoid of sentimentality. It is a world governed strictly by the brutal, uncompromising mathematics of fiduciary duty. As the investors fled and the massive fundraising pipelines began to run dry, the foundational loyalty to the king evaporated. The survival of the $800 billion machine took absolute precedence over the survival of its creator. The co-founders, men who had learned the art of the hostile takeover directly from Black himself, realized they now had to apply those exact same ruthless tactics to the man sitting at the head of the table. The tension within the firm was suffocating. The board of directors, facing open rebellion from shareholders, realized that Black's attempt to manage the Epstein scandal as a private contained legal nuisance was actively destroying the firm's institutional credibility. They forced a highly unusual, humiliating concession from their founder. The board commissioned an outside independent law firm, DeSher LLP, to conduct an exhaustive forensic review of Black's ties to Epstein. This decision is a fascinating psychological pivot, revealing the depth of his fatal weakness. Black, a man whose entire existence was defined by the absolute conviction that he could control any narrative, likely believed that this independent report would serve as his ultimate corporate vindication. He was, after all, the undisputed master of the boardroom. He had spent his life dictating terms to distressed, bankrupt companies. He undoubtedly believed he could contain the scope of the findings, that the elite corporate lawyers would produce a sanitized, heavily redacted whitewash that would pacify the nervous pension funds. He fundamentally mispriced the gravity of his own exposure. The sheer, undeniable volume of the truth was simply too heavy to bury beneath legal jargon. When the Deschères report was finally published in early 2021, it was a masterclass in the lethal precision of corporate law. The report, stretching over 160 pages, technically cleared Black of any direct involvement in Epstein's underlying criminal enterprise. His elite crisis management PR team immediately seized upon this single, narrow conclusion, desperately amplifying it across financial news networks, declaring total and absolute exoneration. However, the market does not read press releases. The market reads the data. The Deschères reporter also put the undeniable forensic proof of the $158 million transfers directly onto the public record. It detailed in excruciating clinical language the bizarre, deeply inappropriate financial enmeshment between the billionaire and the predator. It laid bare the fact that Black had continued to visit Epstein's townhouse and private islands long after the criminal convictions. It documented loans, trust formations, and tax evasion strategies that painted a portrait of a CEO whose judgment was catastrophically compromised. The market's reaction was swift, cold, and merciless. The Deschères report did not exonerate him in the eyes of the public or the limited partners. It merely provided the verified, audited receipts for his moral bankruptcy. It proved that the CEO of one of the world's largest financial institutions possessed a compass that was profoundly, irreparably broken. You cannot restructure a moral bankruptcy. The report was supposed to be his impenetrable shield, but it became the very anvil upon which his career was shattered. The institutional capital remained frozen. The stock price continued to languish. The tipping point had finally arrived. The internal warfare at Apollo escalated from hushed, paranoid conversations in the hallways to a bitter, highly public feud leaking directly to the financial press. The pressure from the board, the crashing stock price, and the relentless media scrutiny finally breached the heavy doors of his corner office. In early 2021, Black announced he would step down as the CEO of Apollo, handing the operational reins to his longtime lieutenant Mark Rowan. Yet even in the face of absolute, undeniable defeat, his hamartia dictated his actions. He simply could not let go. He clung desperately to the title of chairman of the board. He attempted to orchestrate a slow, dignified, multi-month transition that would culminate on his 70th birthday later that summer. He wanted to preserve his aura of total control. He wanted the world to believe he was retiring entirely on his own terms, an esteemed elder statesman gracefully stepping aside after a legendary career. He wanted a coronation, not an execution. But the market is as ruthless as the man who once mastered it. Institutional investors were not satisfied with a half measure or a symbolic transition of power. The mere presence of his name at the top of the firm's letterhead, the mere shadow of his authority lingering in the boardroom, was enough to keep the capital pipelines frozen solid. The co-founders, who had once served him, now actively, aggressively maneuvered against him. They understood a fundamental truth of corporate survival. The firm had to publicly, violently, and permanently amputate its founder to prove to the global markets that the infection was completely eradicated. The man who had spent his entire adult life orchestrating the hostile takeovers of other people's companies, the man who had relentlessly stripped the assets of vulnerable corporations, was now staring down a hostile takeover of His own legacy. The leverage had been entirely inverted. By March of 2021, months before his planned dignified exit, the reality of his isolation became absolute. The pressure became unsurvivable. In a sudden, humiliating capitulation that sent shockwaves through Wall Street, Leon Black resigned entirely. He relinquished the chairmanship. He walked away from the board of directors. He surrendered all operational and strategic control of the behemoth he had birthed from the ashes of the 1980s. The heavy leather chair at the head of the Apollo boardroom, a seat from which he had silently dictated the dismantling of major corporations for 3 decades, sat completely empty. The king was gone, pushed out by the very financial mechanisms of leverage, capital preservation, and unsentimental risk management that he had perfected. The realization must have been visceral and profoundly terrifying for a man of his psychology. For his entire life, he operated on the assumption that money could solve any human equation. But in this final boardroom battle, his massive personal fortune, his armies of elite lawyers, and his carefully constructed corporate fortifications had completely failed him. He had spent his entire life quantifying risk, tearing apart the balance sheets of distressed companies to find their hidden weaknesses, yet he had fundamentally mispriced the cost of his own hubris. The machine he built to cannibalize the weak had recognized him as the weakest link, and it had consumed him without a second thought. It was a flawless, bloodless execution by the capitalist system. But the loss of his corporate crown was only the beginning of the bloodletting. The boardroom of Apollo was a place of pure, unadulterated finance, where decisions were ultimately driven by the cold, rational mathematics of survival. His exile from the financial sector was simply a matter of numbers and fiduciary duty. What awaited him next, however, was a far more intimate, theatrical, and devastating reckoning, because the scandal was no longer contained to the financial pages of the Wall Street Journal. The toxicity was bleeding rapidly out of the financial sector and seeping directly into the velvet-lined corridors of New York's cultural aristocracy. The institutions that had spent 2 decades eagerly cashing his checks, the museums that had etched his name into their marble walls and toasted his refined intellect at glittering galas, were now staring at the gilded monster in their midst. And the corporate assassination he had just suffered was merely the prelude to a much more public, deeply humiliating execution. The elite cultural circles of Manhattan, unlike the pragmatic traders of Wall Street, execute their betrayals with a devastating sense of moral theater. And the stage was now perfectly set for the total, irrevocable liquidation of his carefully purchased cultural identity. The fallout from these scandals effectively dismantled Leon Black's curated legacy. In March 2021, under immense pressure from institutional investors, he stepped down from his operational roles at Apollo. The cultural elite soon followed suit. He relinquished his chairmanship at the Museum of Modern Art, and his name was quietly removed from the institutions he had spent decades funding. Today, his net worth remains over $15 billion. Yet the Manhattan penthouse that once served as the command center of a vast empire is now the boundary of a gilded isolation. He finally has the absolute control he always craved, but it is a control over an empty room, His story leaves a stark historical lesson on Wall Street. Immense wealth can purchase complex legal structures and temporary institutional silence, but it cannot permanently extinguish the truth.